Welcome everyone to the March 2022 Kaktus. This is actually the third Zoom version of the Kaktus series that we've had because we started it in March of 2020. That was our first Zoom, and it's hard to believe. Anyway, it's been obviously a very rough month for the people in Ukraine and the people around the world, and we certainly are keeping them in our thoughts. And I think Jules will be posting a link to the international rescue group. We are also of course, celebrating the March International Women's Month, and we are really pleased to feature two wonderful poets, Leslie Ullman and Dale Kushner, who are, among other things, both associated with 3 Taos Press, which is a woman-owned and operated publisher run by Andrea L. Watson, who's here tonight. And it's a press that's just hold up a couple of their books. A press that's known for just exquisitely designed and printed books by some of the best poets, not only in New Mexico, but all over. And so anyway, we're going to start with tonight with Dale Kushner, and then Leslie Ullman. Then we'll have a short conversation with the poets before we get to our open mic. So Dale Kushner comes to us from Madison, Wisconsin. She is well known as a novelist with award-winning The Conditions of Love, and second novel, The Lie of Forgetting. She's also a columnist for Psychology Today. Had studied at the C.G. Jung Institute in Switzerland, and now has this book, M, which came out this year, as we mentioned, from 3 Taos Press, and I believe she'll be reading from that tonight. There's a long section on Mary Magdalene, but also many other women, some known, some unknown, from many places in history. And anyway, it's a thoroughly engaging book, and we're so pleased that she's able to be with us and start it out tonight. Dale. Please unmute.
Okay. Am I on? Yes. Okay. Well, I am really delighted to be here tonight. This feels like my tribe. I don't know all you guys, but I've been hanging out in the novelist world for more than a couple of years, more like a decade. And so it's really a thrill to be back to my roots are poetry. And I just have to say, it takes me forever to write a novel because as a poet, I have to sub-vocalize every damn sentence I write. It's really hard. So I guess the poets among you will appreciate how we deal with language that's slightly different than people that are just storytellers. So thank you, Jules and John and Leslie. All of you have been so gracious to invite me, and I'm happy to share my new work with you. I did a reading a couple nights ago, And I started with a quote from Bertolt Brecht, which many of you probably know. In dark times, will there also be singing? And one of the other poet readers responded with Brecht's own answer, which is, yes, there will also be singing about dark times. So I was thinking about that tonight because it's kind of a twisted hope that Brecht is expressing, a kind of sad irony that I think feels very relevant in these calamitous times and with so much suffering. And John, I'm so glad you mentioned Ukraine, because I think we all want to keep those people, all of them, they're suffering with us in our hearts. But as a writer, I also hold close something that I just found in one of James Baldwin's essays. And he said, in my mind, the effort to become a great novelist simply involves attempting to tell as much of the truth as one can bear, and then a little bit more, a little bit more. So in Baldwin's America and in our America, the truth he was talking about lives in the shadowy aspects of our culture. They're not so much hidden, I think, as they are unspoken and unsaid. And maybe because those truths for a lot of people are unsayable. For me, the unspoken and the unsaid are the domain of writers, and so are secrets. Sometimes I think writing involves sniffing out secrets. And they might be secrets that we keep from ourselves, or they might be secrets that are sort of floating around in the ethers of the zeitgeist. But I really tried in this book, my new book of poems, which John so kindly held up, which I'm so proud of. It's beautiful. I've really endeavored to tell the truth to the best of my ability. And what does that mean? I think it means I tried to follow a kind of urgency I would feel prior to writing a poem that I felt in my mind and in my body, a kind of prompt. And I think that's something about sniffing out the secrets, that we get pulled into it. So that brings me to my first poem, and the subject is desire, which is something that makes many of us uncomfortable, particularly women's desire. Lately, I've been wondering, how did we get from worshiping earthy, full-breasted, vulva-displaying goddesses to an invisible, disembodied male sky god? I don't quite know. How did we get to have a god who doesn't have a co-creator? And where's our Hera, and where's our Shakti, and where's our female aspect of God? So Eve's desire for knowledge is what apparently got us kicked out of paradise, and that's the poem I want to start with. Eve is the original badass sinner. She's got it pinned on her, and here is the moment of her awakening. What couldn't be said. I got down on all fours, and you came behind, as I knew you would. The fields were not yet fields. Heaven, not yet heaven. I was sick with craving. I couldn't get enough. Soon it would be over, just like that. Just like that. The Lord orchestrating history, needing us for his loneliness and his sorrow. The sky was crumbling. You were frightened for the first time. Dismounting, you staggered backward. I watched you stumble out of the garden. You killed me with that look. Stranger, enemy, bitch. So we got kicked out of that paradise. But here's a poem about a little girl who, through her imagination, was able to form her own sanctuary. It's called Mimi at 6. Under the yellow-starred forsythia, where only arrows of sunlight could find her, there in the back garden, on her throne of dirt, a circle of stones inscribing a border between the worlds, Mimi convened with the gods. Loneliness lifting from her shoulders, wizened oak, pert maple, her protectors, little fugitive, stealing moments from pinch and slap, the lavish thieves of peace. O kingdom where she wandered into the interior of her future self, carting the DNA of ghostkin, scarred by rifle butts and burning shuls, banished tales of stillborns buried in their mothers' graves, the blight, the damage to the bloodline soul, no one spoke. Alive in dreams, the history of ruin held inside herself, merciless work of shame. Uncanny how her ears to family angst, no one dared express. Dark hours when the phantom arms of disappeared reached through the ethers to her bed. But oh, leap the flagstone path to nest of green and lovely shade. Last daffodils like falling stars and scent of mossy earth. Lick salt from skin, taste peppery dirt. Bicker voices from the house drummed out by dancing feet. I've lately been studying mystical Kabbalistic teachings about healing ancestral trauma, intergenerational trauma. And one of the things my teacher has told us is that the dead are really interested in us. And this is mind-boggling when you think about it, they survived all the way down the line. Someone survived so that we could be here. I don't know if any of you watch Finding Your Roots, which is one of my favorite shows. I really want to get on that show. They survived way back, so we could, and we don't even know all their stories. And the teachings go that there's some of the souls are still healing on the other side, and we can help them. I don't know what I actually believe about this, but I really like thinking about it. And so who knows? There's a lot we don't know. So these poems arose out of that course. Okay, excuse me, I just lost my place here. From the other side. I'm sitting on my bed with father, 20 years dead. He's wiping his wire rims, linen hanky plucked from a back pocket, like chiffon from a magician's sleeve. He's wearing his lopsided grin. Outside, the wind is March's anthem, but inside, We've broken and entered memory's mind. Are you lonely? I ask. He shrugs and puts his glasses on. Whatever he's come for tonight, he won't say. Which was always his way. Mr. Clown, Chaplin's kick up your heels, son. Jokes to ward off the cinder block silence building inside him. His eyes so grave, I'd have to look away. I always did, to the blotched galaxy framed in the bedroom window, one or two orphan stars you had to climb on the sill to see. But the stars weren't bright enough to outshine my father's sorrow. How old was I then? 5, 6. Once, snuggling in beside me, I waited for him to reveal the something so sad and terrible it dragged down the corners of his eyelids and made his voice catch like a gate latching shut. But there never was a story for his primal sorrow, his heart attack still years away. Perhaps he was about to warn me how he'd come from a long line of broken-hearted men. Perhaps he saw that loving him had already shaped the woman I would become, and he wanted to call me back for my future. But he never said anything more than, it's a dog-eat-dog world out there. Barbarians in the streets. The middle section of my book is called, the first section is called Via Desiderio, the Way of Desire. The second section is called Via Doloroso, the Way of Sorrow. I think of desire and sorrow as sort of the alchemical factors that help in transformation. And the last section of the book is called Via Transformative. So these are, the middle section are dramatic monologues, and they are in the voices of women who have been caught in war or violence. And I wrote these about 3 years ago. And when I read them now, they are so horribly, terribly prescient. I know Ezra Pound said, poets are the antenna of the race. And I can't claim that sort of highfalutin position, but I don't know if I was picking up on something or whatever. We never know where our poems come from, but I think of these poems as the silenced voices that never get put in history books. And this one is called Myriaki the Netherlands, 1940. I was 7 months pregnant when the troops crossed the border. The dread hours spelled the end of tomorrows. Evenings, the scent of scythed grass, forest birch, blue in the moonlight. As in a dream of halted time, an eternity of engine drone above the clouds. Wing shadows pinned us to the ground. Stunned breath, certain death. Daniel ran from the woodshed, pine dust in his beard, and dragged me from the yard. In the kitchen, I sank to my knees. A rabbit was braising in an iron pot. The baby jackknifed in my womb. I saw a vision of my father already in the next world, watching with pity in his eyes. I saw my mother wrapped in a shawl on a footstool, her lips twisted into a bitter smile. Wars aren't won with prayers, she said. In the evening, the baby arrived in a bath of blood. Daniel wept between my legs and carried our dead child into the woods. The clear night sky fed my secret hope I would survive, though all along the horizon flares, the enemy advancing. Later, I learned the baby had been a boy. Daniel blamed the Germans for his death. Having forgotten the ugly nights he slammed his anger into me, rough lullaby of his hips pounding mine, I've stopped loving him completely now. Blame that on the Germans too, I think. Grief butchering the last tender morsel of hope. This poem, I want to say, is for all the partisans living and dead. You know, one of the reasons I began to study with my teacher about ancestral healing is, and maybe some of you, maybe we'll chat about this later, I've often felt I've carried a kind of darkness that isn't completely mine. And the more I learn about epigenetics and intergenerational trauma, the more I think that's probably true. It isn't completely mine. But I'm sometimes haunted by images of partisans, just particularly during World War II in the forests, you know, hiding in caves and trees and, you know, living on nuts and berries. And so this poem, as I said, is for all the partisans living and dead. It's called Mariska, Poland, 1946. I escaped from a place I never belonged, a forest of permanent shadows, where I hid among the nameless and forsaken who claimed me. And hopeless season after hopeless season, through winter's blue-lipped days, nights when the open secrets of stars filled me with a longing for a childhood stolen in the late days of autumn, the last notes of a Chopin mazurka lifting from Tata's fingers before the stampede of boots on the stairs. Among the birch, we dug tunnels and slept under a crust of dirt. From a nest of larks, we pillaged the unborn. Because you fed me, I became one of you. I believed your fate was my fate. I was loyal to your fear. Terror made us legible to each other and to ourselves. Our bodies stank like hunted beasts. Meanwhile, the earth orbited the sun. The moon became a sad hypothesis. Large countries swallowed smaller countries, and the vowels of the old language choked in our throats. Soldiers' uniforms changed colors, but we were not saved. Not even clouds that promised rain did we trust. We wondered if we would ever be human again. What had become us, we knew was not us, just as at the moment of death, the heart pitifully refuses and quakes with new life.
Wow, Dale.
So I think I better end with two short poems that have a little bit more hope. This one is called, this is also for a dramatic monologue, but it's not quite a war poem. It's a prayer, yay. It's called Meli, United States, 2020. And people have asked me why the book is called M. Every speaker in in the book, her name starts with M. And I can talk more about that. There's also some mystical stuff with M. But anyway, Melly, United States, 2020. Day of dog walkers, sidewalk evangelists, abandoned theaters, boy sobbing on his yellow bike. I pray for you. Doomed soldiers of extinct kingdoms, lovers with padlocked faces, storefronts empty of 10,000 things, haters casting the first stone. For you, I pray. For the disappeared and about to disappear, the friend whose mind has turned to dust. Come, let us gather at the banks of the possible, trumpets and French horns blaring. Stars of blue flame ignite a riot of hope in our souls. Let the torn shoelace repair itself. Let the crazy doves outsing the rain. May the wounded and wounders awake unafraid and breathe the same air. Thank you. I like it. We're all going to do this now. Yay. I love it. I have one more quick poem, if I may. It's called Guardian Angel. I longed for you. Dusk at the windows, swallows cutting between the trees, golden blue their wings. I was a child faithful to night's promises, my heart an open hand. Winter's dark silence or the lavish prophecy of summer stars, I did not abandon you, patient pilgrim that I was. A silver feather beside my pillow might have been enough, but the wretchedness lived on. Did I neglect, dear angel, to look where you were hiding, not in the drifting heavens, but hovering near, your infinite breath brushing my shoulder, the flutter of your wing against my dream. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. We can all
Thank you.
clap.
And unmute for a second.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Very good.
Wonderful.
Beautiful.
Beautiful.
Beautiful and moving. Thank you.
Wow. Really?
Nice.
And I really think you owe it to yourself, folks, to go to the website for Three Ataos Press and pick up your own copy of M. All right. Thank you so much, Dale.
Thank you.
And we'll talk a little bit about your prescience and other things in a few minutes. Okay, so next up from Taos, New Mexico is Leslie Ullman, who taught for many years down in El Paso to our south, and headed up the creative writing program at the University of Texas there. Leslie is the author of 5 poetry collections. I got one here. The you that, here it is. The you, it's hard to say this, the you that all along has housed you, a sequence from 9 Mile Press, and the Library of Small Happiness, which is a collection of essays and poems and writing exercises, which is from Three Ataos Press. And I also had one from University of New Mexico Press, Progress on the Subject of Immensity. And she has a new book that will be coming out from University of New Mexico Press titled Unruly Tree. Leslie is also a faculty member in the MFA program at Vermont College of the Fine Arts, and has won numerous awards, including the Iowa Poetry Prize, the Yale Series of Younger Poets Award, 2 NEA fellowships, and a New Mexico, Arizona Book Award for poetry. Give it up for Leslie Ullman.
Thank you so much. I love your organization, and I love that you're my neighbors. I feel so cut off sometimes from a lot of poets, but there you are. And Dale, your reading was wonderful. It's such a delight to see your face and to hear you read. I'm so happy for you. I could say more, but I'm glad that John sent the link to therescue.org. I'm glad that Dale mentioned Ukraine. I start every morning reading The Guardian and the New York Times. I'm living with it like the rest of you. I am not talking about that in my presentation tonight, because I think what I'm going to focus on is what it is about writing poetry that makes me feel centered, and that I'm in a sacred space and a healing space where I can feel most intact, and maybe from that intactness in a very small way, help the atmosphere, the way meditation people say that if enough of us meditate, we might make a difference. I don't know if that's true, but what I want to talk about first, I'm going to read a few of the poems from Library of Small Happiness, which is a hybrid book of craft essays, writing exercises, and poems. And my first poem is at the end of an essay I wrote called The Personal Poem as Sacred Space. And I dealt with the work of Linda Paston, Jane Kenyon, Jack Gilbert, and William Stafford. And this book is an homage to my favorite writers, with a few of my poems thrown in and my favorite exercises thrown in. But I really do feel that as writers, if we can get into that still sacred space where we can write from our real personhood, not to be mistaken for being too personal, we can come up with, we can remake ourselves, or we can keep ourselves intact and maybe help other people be intact. So at the end of that essay, The Personal Poem is Sacred Space, I have a poem of mine, which is also the title poem of this book, Library of Small Happiness. And in my way, I was trying to address that sacred space. Sunlight early in the day is expectant, experimental, liquid slanting across the just waking room. Now a page is opened, and the mind, the heart, turned gently as a glued spine, turned gently as a glued spine cracks, well-made thoughts taken out and taken apart, and the night's fast still unbroken. A pleasure to leave flesh free of bread's weight, as time too stays weightless, and the room hums with light. A voice rises from the page towards the voice within, or maybe it's just from within. It shapes the hours to come. Oh, expectant, silky morning. Oh, lion lying down with the lamb, as though the room were forest replete with moss and ripe fruit. Word clouds lift the body inside the body, weightless and without demand. So heaven must be like this, free of purpose and lit with intelligence that needs no proof. The body weightless and without demand. Each taken apart thought remaking itself and going where it's never been. The mind, the heart, such a fine book, cracking and cracking its spine that never breaks. So later in the book, in the exercise portion, I have a little part about the poetic inversion as a great exercise to get writers started. And it really means writing the opposite of what somebody else's poem is saying. And usually I do this like phrase by phrase, so that I'm not writing the opposite of their ideas or really making any sense out of them or out of myself. I just get these bits of language and then I have to put them together into something else. So I usually end up with something that bears no resemblance to the source poem. But in this case, I found myself so taken with a poem by George Gilbert and so a little bit pissed off by it that I ended up writing the opposite of what he was saying and kind of using his poem as a template for my own. So my poem does bear more, this poem, the one I'm going to read bears a fair amount of resemblance to his, except that his is half a page and mine's a page and a half. I'm going to read you his poem first, because I think you'll hear the conversation between them. The History of Men by Jack Gilbert. It thrashes in the oaks and sows in the elms, catches on innocence and soon dismantles that. Sends children bewildered into life. Childhood ends and is not buried. The young men ride out and fall off, the horses wandering away. They get on boats, are carried downstream, discover maidens. They marry them without meaning no harm, the language beyond them. So everything ends. Divorce gets them nowhere. They drift away from the ruined women without noticing, see birds high up and follow. Out of earshot, they think, puzzled by earshot. History driving them forward, making a noise like a wind in Naples, of women in their dresses. It stings their hearts finally. It wakes them up, baffled in the middle of their lives on a small bare island, the sea blue and empty, the days stretching all the way to the horizon. I think I needed to push back against how these men get away with being so callow. So this is what I did with it. The History of Women after Jack Gilbert. The history of women sighs from the iron across the empty sleeves, the exacting collars, and edges along the porch rail. It rises in the arc of a jump rope, then dissolves in a flurry of rhyme. Step on a crack, break your mother's back. It sends some children home to the table waiting to be set for 8, away from the fragrant dusk, away from the last secret whispered behind cupped hands. Still, there are days when a girl roams alone in her body, humming and dreaming, a heroine among weeds and wildflowers. When childhood ends, it is cut at the root. For a time, the young beauties spring lightly from buses to offices without windows, thinking they will always be pretty and soon will leave town. Understandable then that marriage appears to them as an offer. They mean to accept. Then they mean to make the best of it, swimming in a current that keeps them in one place, smoothing oil of Olay over their useful hands, comforting their mothers whose sadness ceases to baffle them. They wave the last child into the evening, the first in a string of crucible nights, and try not to pace at the window. Divorce leaves them stunned, supple as leather, stranded for a time on a long path towards love. At times, they see a beauty in each other mirrored nowhere in the eyes of men, or in movies they watch when they can't sleep. Waiting in a long line to vote, they sense the shape of themselves briefly, like ice cubes dropped in a lake. Though the speeches have blurred to a long hush, waves against sand, so history drives them inward with the sound of someone clearing his throat. Then one day, it wakes them up in the middle of their lives, in a house that smells of cinnamon or wood smoke, surrounded by a small wild yard. Scrubbed apples drying on a cloth, the sun just setting, gold over the valley's greens. Silence everywhere, softening the horizon and bringing it even closer. And I have another exercise in this book, writing a poem, taking someone else's first line. And I've done this a lot with Latin American poets in translation, whose first lines have a lot of energy. The one I'm going to read now, what's interesting when you do this, when you take a prompt for a title or a first line, it takes you somewhere you didn't know you were going to go, or at least it takes me. And in this one, it's called Birthday, and the line is by Homero Aridis. To emerge from woman is to become separate. And I just took part of a first line and then I ran with it. And I ended up writing something so much more dire than what I really feel about childhood. I've just recently spent time around very little kids, and I'm just amazed at their curiosity and their glee and their eagerness to embrace the world. In this poem, I am so not talking about that, and I didn't know I was going to go there. And I think that's what I love about this exercise. So this is my little journey that I didn't know I was going to take. Birthday. To emerge from woman is to become separate from the ease of floating, from water as air. That first sunset could be sky ripping itself apart, calling back the ruin of flesh. To emerge from woman is to look back just once at a calm too deep for words before turning to the startled faces, white stones huddled around the shore of it, and the voices that rise among them, noise without shape, and a darkness called night that might feel safe if it were water, not air, edgy and full of eyes. Years will pass before amber lights winking in the hills are a comfort, before a grid of bone and muscle can be trusted to hold the body in its own axis. To emerge from woman is to be ambushed by the wonder and burden of limbs. The first time a hand, a leg is dragged upward, the world begins again and suddenly is spinning, has always been spinning. Such effort it will take to stay aboard. Years will pass before one's wails, wrenched from a sadness whose depths close overhead and will never be crested, arrange themselves into word and phrase and a barely supportable silence. To emerge from woman is to feel the throat drowning in air and for a long time to be afraid of water. I'm going to read you couple of poems, 4 poems from this book, which was published by 9 Mile Press in Lafayette, New York. I don't know, some of you are from, I think, that part of New York. I don't know how close. Bob Hertz is the editor. He was a classmate of mine at University of Iowa, and I was really pleased to have a book published by him. When I started doing those poems after people's first lines, it kind of drifted me into trying to use my own lines as prompts. So this whole book, there was a poem I started with, and I'll tell you how that came up. But then after that first poem, I would just take the ending of each poem, and it would either be the title or the first line of the following poem. And the whole book does that. And for me, I have found that when I write that way, I end up saying things I didn't know I was going to say, like in the last poem. But in this one, I think I felt pretty playful. I found myself writing some personal things, some very meditative, speculative things. In and out, I realized, when Dale mentioned ancestral, how we carry things through ancestral history, which I agree with, I found myself encountering something I've always believed in, but never really addressed, the possibility that we have lived many lives and we carry our own lifetimes into each successive lifetime. And I think I'm really intrigued by that. I have no proof of that. I just find it metaphorically, it makes a lot of sense. So that comes up a lot in this book. You'll hear a little of it, not much. But this book traveled in a lot of different directions, mostly because I let my little prompts take me there. The first poem was a Facebook question, and I decided to try answering it in a poem. So I'm going to read the first two poems in this book and the last two. Facebook question: what do you remember about 1987? A divorce. My friends and I seeking higher versions of ourselves in sweat lodges, hypnosis, and Sufi dancing. Phyllis, Monica, Kelly, Ken. Red wine days, vegetarian days, Madonna, Michael Jackson, and the noisy hum of a K-Pro 16 as words flowed through my fingers in green, MS-DOS, the new frontier. A 40th birthday, potluck with margaritas, friends wandering into the nearby fields with poems on their breath, and me held briefly in the glow of a new perfect love. Kathleen, Sandra, Terry, Renee. I drove a Toyota Tercel and wore long beaded earrings. Listened to a Walkman while riding Burley along the mesa, picking spines out of my heart and moving under a shroud of promises to myself I had broken. One night, I found a rattlesnake in my house. Hollowed out and ready for rebirth by the end of the year, I learned to breathe out angers I could touch and sorrows I didn't know had been hiding. The breathing got deeper. The snake got away. U2, Whitney Houston, the Moody Blues. The breathing was like digging with a sharp stick and the peeling away of masks. Masks. Feathers in the hair, midnight above the lashes, thigh-high boots, rooms filled with the shimmer of wind chimes, the anguish of Coltrane, the water and fig and leaf-filtered light of Satie. I read the story of O and didn't like it, but something made me reach for the chords it missed. Desire as black diamond, not quite danger. Sometimes I watched Lawrence Welk for a furtive return to my mid-century childhood, embalmed as it was in the syrup of his careful English, the accordions and bland lyrics, so much smiling and blondness, innocence tenacious as tar. I cringed with embarrassment and longing. My nature made no sense to me, nor did the future. I was like everyone I knew. I preferred foods I couldn't recognize, bite-sized jewels scattered on trays in minimally furnished salons I could only imagine. Even the hosts dressed in black and ate standing up. Soft lighting soothed their bisque walls from which my imagination withdrew its clutter. I conjured places where I could imagine starting over. And then the last two poems in the book ends up making kind of a trajectory, which I didn't intend, but I was delighted that it kind of did. This second to last poem is called Lighter Than Air. I came into this world as a fist of cells, a pebble, aware of its weight, even as it floated in a night sea. And part of me remains in the dark, astonished by the life I find myself in, its cities, its lights, swift travel, love, lies, heated rooms, and soft places to sleep. Where was I before? I watched my father relinquish in his 96th year whatever had anchored him to this world, the woods, the smell of motor oil, lake water, tools, the remembered taste of tobacco, leaving the weight of what he would be after fire had changed bone to something like sand, and the rest had moved somewhere else. The last poem is Somewhere Else. I think I've been a boulder in other lives, harder to move than I am in this one. Perhaps I'll be finer in my next. At times, I can almost silence the goings on in my head, noise of here and now, a granular frequency that may not be all, but is mostly what I hear. I would like to know what my father saw while I sat beside him, and breath and warmth left his body imperceptibly with surprising gentleness, as though a feather had passed over us both. I would like to know if it changed me too, but for now I remain a handful of something hard thrown against glass, someday ash, most of which will sink into the soil it came from, and a trace of which may float if I keep asking, into mist, then air, then something thinner. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
Thank you. We can all applaud. Yeah,
Yes.
marvelous. Thank you.
Yes.
Very nice,
Impressive.
very nice.
This is going to unpin so we can go to gallery maybe and see everybody. So, well,
I've got everybody on here. I'm gonna add Dale in as well.
okay,
So we can have,
wonderful. Yeah.
and and feel free to unmute, because I know the chat is not working for everybody except the host, and that's my mistake. And we haven't been able to fix it. So feel free to chime in as well.
Yeah,
as people request it.
absolutely. Let's see. I guess I have a couple of questions, I guess, starting with Dale. And first of all, I'm just, was just blown away by M, and almost that sense of almost channeling these women. And you mentioned the prescience of that so many of the women have stories revolving around war and being refugees and so forth, and yet you wrote this before, so
I wish I could explain. I can't. The voices, I've never, well, as a novelist, of course, I'm very used to characters. I'm very used to inhabiting other beings. That's very natural for me.
Yeah. Mhm.
But, one thing about this, I'm learning, I don't really know my ancestry. Many of us don't. I mean, that's why I mentioned Finding My Roots, because he always picks some, I don't know if all of you know what that program is. It's
Henry Louis
Louis
Gates.
Gates. And he usually has people on, and then he does these DNA tests, and they find out they thought they were 100%, Northern European, and they actually have, Indonesian or whatever. I don't think we quite know what we're made out of in some way, or maybe even if we get the DNA, I'm not sure that covers all of what we are.
Mhm.
And I'm sort of stumbling for words because I don't want to sound too mystical, but I do think we have access to things, as Jung would say, in the collective unconscious, And so whether these poems were predictive, I can't say, but they came very suddenly and very clearly. And there's someone from Haiti, there's someone from Spain, and there were these very small incidents like this, the ones I read where, she gave birth, or something else happened. It was almost as if I saw these little incidents and they just came out. But I'd love to hear, we have a group of writers here. I'd love to hear other people's experiences with this, your own included, John.
Well, I've been actually, I in December 2020 lost a beloved aunt, somebody who was sort of the matriarch of the family and was a teacher and was in her 90s and unfortunately died of COVID. But that spurred me to start doing genealogical research, and from that to start writing some I call ancestry poems. I don't know if there's a better word for that, but there was a phrase you used earlier about the burden of ancestry or something.
Well, I'll just say one more thing about that, is that there's a book called The Ancestor Syndrome. And the Ancestor Syndrome, it's by I believe she's a German psychiatrist. And it's very fascinating. For instance, the case studies would be someone comes into her as a patient, a contemporary person, and they're having choking symptoms, and there's nothing physically wrong with them. And they go through a lot of tests, and through working with dreams and trying to get to the bottom of it, they discover the great-grandfather had mustard gas in World War I.
Wow.
And that's what I mean. It's hard. You can't say it's not genetic. It may be epigenetic. I mean, epigenetics, I know there was a huge study in Holland where the women that had famine during the World War II, their second generation had a much higher incidence of diabetes. And so there are things like that. There's a lot written. I don't want to take up too much time, but I do feel that, those of us, many of us who are in the arts are kind of sensitive beings. And I think that we're often tuned into things that are unsaid and unspoken. I bet most of you would agree, right?
Yeah. Yes. And Holly Wilson in the chat, I guess, mentioned that Leslie had also mentioned reincarnation in some respect in one of hers.
And our chat is working again now.
Oh, wow. How did that happen? The mystery.
Well, I
Talk about
was
the mysteries.
Googling a little bit and playing around with different things.
Yeah.
Anyways.
I wanted to just turn to Leslie for a second. I just found this book to be a real delight. And you explained a little bit how these sequence poems, how they got started and how they work. But I was interested that I thought when I was reading it that there seemed to be a kind of full circle thing that happened. And you said it wasn't intentional, just kind of happened that way, which is interesting. But even though they are kind of free, I would say, free flights of the imagination, yet there's a trajectory. And there's something, I think, about that beginning-ending sequence that, propels the reader, but I think it also maybe propels the poet in some way, so that even though it's not a traditional narrative poem, it seems to me there's a trajectory. Did you feel that?
Yeah, I think it's a evolution of sensibility, and I think this relates to what we've been just talking about. And almost everyone here is a writer, and you all have probably wondered, how did this come to me? Why did I just say this? And it feels true. And Dale and I have been talking a lot recently about ancestral memory, but before we both kind of got into it, we read the same book, and she's been passing on her homework assignments to me, and I've been doing them. But before that, I was really intrigued by the fact that, how did I come to be like the way I am? And could I be bringing this from other experiences of my own? So I was thinking of former lifetimes, because to me, it explained, if we do come back, and especially if we do choose the lives we come back to, it answers so many questions. And I know that sounds super woo-woo, and I don't really go around saying, oh, I've been these things in other lives. I don't go around with that. But I welcome anything that comes to me that could come from experience I may have had before the one I have now. And when Dale and I started talking about ancestral trauma and ancestral vibes, it all dovetailed together. And I think we both think about these things anyway, even before we started talking about them a couple of years ago. So in the You That All Along Has Housed You, I am exploring the person speaking these poems in some ways is sort of a stranger in a strange land. Like, what am I doing here? And do I belong here? You know, I'm around people who seem to belong here, and I'm not sure I do. And I had a lot of fun with that. It was sort of fun to be a stranger in a strange land, looking at the world through this clean lens. And that was part of the play of the book. I'm kind of rambling, but it's a rambling kind of a subject, and there are no answers to it. But boy, does it fuel the imagination. It's just gold.
Yeah, I've written a couple of books about a character named Joe the Poet, who I'm still trying to figure out who Joe is. So,
Don't try.
is there anyone else that has some thoughts along these lines or other lines?
I have one thought. I'm Dave Hinkhouse. Leslie was.
Dave, hi.
Hi, how are you? Leslie was my mentor a long time ago. We neither one would admit the number of years, but I found out, like, after I took her classes, she's born the same year as me. I always thought that was pretty cool. Anyhow, that the what makes us us and what makes us writers and what ends up on a page when we're done that we were surprised by and we'd had no idea it was in there. It's a wonderful pleasure in life to have no one else even read your poem, and you know you wrote a good one until Leslie reads it, and then she tells you how to make it better. But
people
I
did that to
think
me
that
too, by the way.
I think that the smallest moments in life, I told this to my students quite often, that you can miss them. Though you can miss that one moment. Like, most of life is grunt. We grunt it out. We get up, blah, blah, blah. But there are those moments that poetry helps you tune into that change lives, change your life, change. And it can be one sentence that somebody said. Like in my master's program, somebody compared me to Socrates. It's the first time that I had ever been compared to a famous philosopher, and I felt pretty damn good about that, and it changed my whole life in the way that I looked at myself. One sentence that someone said that let me know that, hey, you know, I'm smart too. And, you know, taking Leslie's classes and blundering through the awkward stages of, you know, the initial writing process where you're just groping for anything. But I think they're small sometimes. I think that they're really small and they're not big necessarily. I was a director, and I'm rambling now. I was a director, and it was always, I waited for that one night when we practiced. Just, it was the most frustrating experience for the first 4 or 5 weeks to direct plays. And you wait for that one night when one person on the stage does one thing good that fires it up, and it lights everybody else up on the stage, and they go, oh, so that's what this is about, you know, whoa. And then you can stop it. And that one sentence, that one moment is so crucial to be able to build from there. But that's my thought on that. And I'm not sure about reincarnation and all that
Thank
stuff.
you. That was quite insightful. Thanks, David.
Well, I took up way too much time.
Dale had some, yeah.
I just want to add something to the brew here. I don't know if any of you know the Richard Powers novel Overstory, which has trees as characters. So not only might we be interconnected to relatives we don't know. We can expand our vision to include all sentient things, which I think is rather interesting because, you know, there are all these books, The Hidden Life of Trees. Richard Powers' book is just amazing, Overstory. Yeah.
I was gonna say in New Mexico, it's rocks, you know, it's
rocks, it's
desert,
rocks.
it's mountains.
Or the soul
Yeah.
of an octopus, animals,
Right.
amphibians.
Animals. Absolutely.
We have time, maybe one more comment or question.
I'd like,
Carolyn had
I'd
one. Yeah.
I would like to ask,
Janet and then Carolyn. Yeah.
oh, yeah.
Go ahead, Janet.
Dale, when you spoke about what you weren't sure was going on deep within you, or as though somebody else was part of you. When I was born, just about the date that World War II started, I was born very healthy. My mother was nursing me, and I didn't stop crying apparently for 2 years. And it turned out that my grandma Rivka and her family in Romania was being murdered at that point with what was going on from the Nazis and the concentration camps. And I didn't really understand that coincidence until I thought more about history and what was going on where she was living. The other thing that's kind of more joyful is that I had my DNA done with a British scientist group, Living DNA, and found out that 10,000 years ago, I was in northern India.
You have a lot of material there.
It's a lot.
I hope you
bookstore.
mind that. But that's a really powerful story about you're crying. And,
Yeah.
you know,
Incredible.
really, you know, one of the ways that I think about mystery, and I think our human perceptions have narrowed so much over the generations. And I like to go, you know, look at the animal world. You know, bees can see these things called nectaries inside flowers that help them land right to the pollen. We can't see them with our eyes.
Yeah.
You know, we're limited. So maybe there's a lot of mysteries we just can't see. You know,
Yes.
I really think so.
Yes. Yes.
Good.
And the flowers have electricity also that they send messages to the bees.
Mhm.
Is that it's probably what you just said, isn't it?
No, these are ultraviolet. Some, you know, they have different eyes.
Yeah.
than things.
Different eyes.
They-
Yeah.
yeah.
Carolyn, you were gonna say something?
Yeah, hi. Thank you. This has been a most stimulating reading and conversation, and I love it when this occurs at readings. And I don't think this is possible. This has not been so possible except in these Zoom rooms where we
Yes.
listen differently
Yeah.
than we do when we're in a room full of actual people. Both have their good qualities. But what I wanted to ask Leslie really quickly or comment was you were talking about what I might call the anti-palimpsest, where you reply to another poet or to a poem by another poet. And if I understand correctly, taking that poem and in a way turning it inside out, or doing it, doing a sort of a contrary to what that poet was saying in his or her poem. And you used the example of Jack Gilbert. And can you say something more about that? How productive has that been for you? Have you sometimes done the palimpsest where it's sort of not, it's a rephrasing or a different look, but not necessarily an opposite? I mean, opposite is wonderful, but maybe.
Oh, I love that term. It sounds extremely authoritative as opposed to my groping. I have only done one other poem that started out as a poetic inversion where I was expecting just to get these little pieces of language that I would then have to reassemble. So every once in a while I read a poem that makes me want to have a conversation with it. And Betsy Scholl I think is with us tonight. She and I teach together in Vermont, and we did a workshop about poetry and conversation with other poems. And it was really fun. And we got a lot of great examples and the students did great things. And I realized that most of my conversations with other poems are not so direct, but with the Gilbert poem, I think just because, as a woman, my hackles rose. Like, how do they get away with riding off and forgetting about these wives? I mean, you know, the women are in labor and the men are out there smoking cigars. And that was that kind of thing. I always had a little chip on my shoulder about this stuff. So that poem gave me a platform. I just had to go there. And I have one other poem in progress on the subject of immensity, where I took Jane Hirschfield's Lives of the Heart, and I wrote the habitual gestures of the mind. And I was basically talking about how the mind does not do what the heart does. So I've only done this twice, but I guess what happens sometimes is a poem just makes you want to have that conversation. Yeah. I can't say that I've done it a lot, but when I have done it, it was so clear to me that I wanted to. And in both cases, the poems just came out, you know, it was a lot of fun, and I was at no loss as to what to say. But what is your term again? I got to write it down. Palimpsest?
I call it, I have a couple of names for it. One is the more serious name, which is the poetic palimpsest.
The poetic palimpsest.
Palimpsest, yes.
Do you do them?
Yeah, I do them.
Oh. We have to talk about this some more later.
Yes, we need to stay in touch. I think I have your email, and I think I have Betsy's email also, and I'm so glad to see you as well. We've all been in touch over the years at various times, so that would be great. The other term, what I was thinking for what you were saying, I said the anti-palimpsest, which I'm thinking of, you know, Nicanor Parra's anti-poems or anti-poemas, you know. And then the other thing I call it is the poet writes back, the poet strikes back.
That gets to it.
And we've got poetry and play, which is the whole concept of the poetry.
Well, I think that could make a great workshop, Carolyn.
Well, let's do it. Let's plan. Let's plan.
Let's.
You know, AWP is going to be in Seattle next year. Let's plan something.
That's right. Oh, that's exciting.
That's where I am. I'm in Seattle, so
that's exciting.
You know, and if you guys are planning to come, let's plan something.
All right. Good. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. We've got to get to our open mic, but let's have another round of applause for Leslie Dale and everybody. Yeah.